Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas. In our brand new study, we're going to take a look at the Paul's letter to the Colossians, and I'm going to use the commentary. I'm going to use several commentaries, but we're going to focus in on Dr. Douglas J. Moo and his pillar commentary on Colossians. That'll be the central commentary that we use. But I look forward to this study because this was one of the first commentaries I ever wrote. I wrote a commentary on Colossians in 1974, a while back. And I've got it here in my library. But it was my second year at Trinity Baptist Church in Fort Worth. And the first year I was at Trinity Baptist, I wrote a commentary on James. And then the second year I wrote a commentary on Colossians. And so I've got my own commentary available. I've saved it, and it's printed up in a hardcover edition, and it's here in my library. And I'm glad that I did save it for future reference. But I look forward to this study on Colossians because Colossians is a letter written by Paul in response to heresy. And specifically, it's a letter written in response to the heresy of Gnosticism. Gnosticism was starting to build up an influence. This was written around AD 60, and from AD 60 to the end of the first century, Gnosticism was starting to take hold, and Paul is responding to this heresy, which was a heresy that taught that between God and creation there are a series of emanations. The Gnostics taught emanationism. They taught that between God and creation there were a series of emanations, and as a collective whole, that series of emanations was called the pleroma. In Greek, that mediation series was called the pleroma, the fullness of the emanations. Paul countered this by saying that Christ and Christ alone is mediator between God and creation. There is no series of emanations. There is no doctrine of asceticism where the believer must climb a ladder of higher levels of mystery religion, higher levels of gnosis. All of that is a heresy. So in this letter, we're going to take a journey through Paul's response to Gnosticism, and we're just going to begin by taking a look at introductory material, and I've got three different perspectives on the introduction to take a look at here in this first lesson, and then next lesson we will begin with the actual text. So this time we're just going to launch things with a look at the introductory material. And one person I love to go to in every study is Scofield. Scofield, I think, is very good. He was a fundamentalist, but even so, he was very strong in biblical studies. And so I'm going to begin with Block 1, an introduction by Scofield. And we learned that the date of the writing was AD 60. The author is Paul. The theme is the preeminence of Christ and Christ alone. It is written in Rome during Paul's first imprisonment. Colossae is located about 100 miles east of Ephesus. Paul never personally visited Colossae. See 1:7 and 2:1. The church had actually been established by one of Paul's converts in his 3-year ministry in Ephesus. That person was Epaphras. Epaphras was a disciple of Paul in Ephesus, and then he returned to Colossae to found the church there. So he was a disciple of Paul, but Paul didn't establish that church. It was Epaphras. Colossae had been infiltrated by the influence of Gnosticism. Now, Block 1, Note 2, the heresy of Gnosticism. Christ was undervalued and not a part of the eternal Godhead. Between God and creation was an entire series of emanations called the pleroma. It did include the worship of angels and a false asceticism, a false method of salvation as self-denial. You had to earn your salvation. To counter this heresy, Paul taught the concept of epignosis, or the fullness of knowledge is in Christ bodily, in Christ bodily. Therefore, Christ is the only mediator, not emanations. And that's the theme we're going to see throughout this letter. Paul's going to emphasize the mediation of Christ and Christ alone, and the fullness of knowledge in Christ bodily. The fullness of divine knowledge in Christ bodily. Now the outline, the introduction runs chapter 1, 1 through 8. Then there's the Apostles' Prayer, chapter 1, 9 through 14. And then the theme of the preeminent glory of Christ, chapter 1, 15 through 23. Then there is the concern for the church over this heresy that has crept in. That's going to be 124 through 223. And then we close out with abundant life for the believer, 3:1 to 4:6. So that gives us our framework in Block 1. And Block 1 basically introduced us to the heresy of Gnosticism. Now Block 2 is going to talk about what Paul combated this heresy with, and that is a vocabulary of preparedness. Paul posited a vocabulary of spiritual preparedness. Let's go to Block 2. It was for an ancient people. The most ancient people in the world were the citizens of Colossae, located in Phrygia. The Phrygians claimed to be the world's most ancient people, even more ancient than the Egyptians, and Egypt agreed. They held that same opinion. The gospel was first taught by Epaphras, who heard the gospel from Paul in Paul's 3-year ministry in Ephesus, and then Epaphras returned to his countrymen in Colossae. Because in Colossians 2:1, Paul confesses that all in Colossae, or at least some in Colossae, have not seen him in the flesh. Now Luke does say that Paul passed through Phrygia more than once, so that's why I say it could be just some hadn't seen him, because Luke does say that Paul passed through Phrygia more than one time, visiting the cities in that province. So did he visit Colossae personally or not? It seems like the answer is no, he did not, but we have to leave that question open, because some may not have seen Paul personally, but some may have. Luke says that Paul had passed through Phrygia more than one time. Block 2, Note 3, the Christians in Colossae had been prepared to stand firm. Paul declares that they had been rightly taught the gospel. Paul tells the believers in Colossae, you have been rightly taught the gospel. And then he gives them the preparedness vocabulary. And it's in Colossians 2:7. You have been firmly established. You have been those who have been able to build upon a foundation in Christ. You have been confirmed by the faith that you were properly taught. You had follow-up teaching. So Colossians 2:7 gives us the preparedness vocabulary from Paul. They had been firmly established with a foundation, and then they had even had follow-up spiritual building upon that foundation in Christ. They've been confirmed by a true faith because they were taught by genuine, rightly taught gospel. So it's this preparedness vocabulary that we have here in Colossians 2:7. Let's go on to block 3, and we'll take a look at the summary statement here for the introduction. In block 3, I actually got from David Pawson. Negation of Gnostic heresy and a affirmation of a preservation of preparedness and faith gives us a gospel that must not be diluted. The third race of a new humanity. At the time of Paul's writing, a new Christian humanity had been into existence for about 30 years, because this is AD 60, and we've got to figure that the Passion was around AD 30. So it's the establishment of the church at Pentecost. The church has been into existence for approximately 30 years at this point. The church was located in the valley of Turkey, called Colossae. Paul is going to tell them what they must believe. Paul's going to tell them what they must believe to counter Gnosticism. And he can do this because he has apostolic authority. He is an ambassador to create a third race of believers in Christ. At the conclusion of the Gospel of Mark, a Roman centurion recognizes the authority of Christ even over himself. Paul declares that the gospel that they heard from Epaphras must not be diluted. Paul addresses them as brethren because they share the same God as Father. And like I said, this block 3 was taken from David Pawson in his commentary. So we get a good introduction here to kind of get us started. Basically, block 1 gave us the heresy of Gnosticism. Block 2 gave us Paul's response to the heresy of Gnosticism. He countered it with a vocabulary of spiritual preparedness. And block 3 wrapped it up with negation of Gnostic heresy plus preservation of preparedness in the faith yields a gospel that must not be diluted. Paul says, stand firm in the faith against the Gnostics. Do not allow them to undervalue Christ. Christ needs to be affirmed as that mediator who is the only mediator between God and humanity. Christ is the only mediator. He is the Messiah. He is the Christos Messiah. He is the Kyrios Lord. He is the Krenos judge. He is the Son of Man come down from heaven. Christ is the one and only mediator between God and humanity. And the pleroma, the fullness of divine knowledge, is in Christ. The pleroma, which is Greek for fullness. The pleroma is in Christ. The fullness of all divine knowledge, the fullness of all divine wisdom is in Christ bodily. In Christ, the incarnate Messiah. Paul emphasizes incarnation, a doctrine of incarnation. Christ is sole mediator. Christ contains within himself the pleroma, the fullness of divine wisdom. You don't need to join this cult of Gnosticism that says that you need to climb the ladder of gnosis up through the emanations. You have to earn your salvation. No, this heresy must be negated. This heresy must be condemned. Paul condemns Gnosticism, and Paul affirms the need to be prepared in the faith with a rightly taught gospel. Be prepared with a rightly taught gospel. You need the follow-up of teaching. The follow-up of teaching is necessary, and it must be a follow-up of a rightly taught gospel. And if that takes place, if you have that preparedness, then the gospel will not be diluted. It will not be diluted. It will not. You are a new humanity. And you know that from Epaphras, my messenger, my disciple Epaphras, who brought you the gospel. And now you need to follow up with genuine, solid, rightly taught teaching and stand firm in the faith against the heresy of Gnosticism. What about today in our culture? I mean, let's admit it. There are so many places we can point where Christ is undervalued. In our culture, Christ is undervalued, or Christ is ignored entirely. There's no room for a realm of spirit in our culture. The cult of the woke agenda denies Christ. The cult of the woke agenda